Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to the last of our normal kind of speaker series for this semester. We do have one more event that we're co-sponsoring with the South Asia Institute on Friday and Saturday, but this is our last public lecture of this semester, and it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome Amoria Armstrong, who is a professor at Virginia Tech, and my colleague Andrea White will be introducing her very shortly. I also want to thank Chloe Samalafo for introducing me to Amoria's work. We were having some fantastic discussions at the beginning of the semester about political theology, and it was really wonderful to come across Professor Armstrong's work, and we're looking forward to the talk tonight. So my name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of IRCPL, and this is an event in our kind of omnibus series on religion, culture, and public life, obviously addressing issues of pressing interest and importance, not only in the United States, but more broadly. And I think Chloe's work, which is focused on Africa, might bring some of that out. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation between the two of them. But I just want to offer a few words of housekeeping before we get started, and then I will introduce Andrea White. So we're running tonight as a webinar. It's being recorded, so please feel free to let your friends and colleagues know that it will be available after probably after Friday or so, once we get the video up on our website. But I want to thank my colleagues at IRCPL for helping make this event possible, especially Gabby Lee, who is here behind the scenes running the webinar. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Departments of Religion and Political Science here at Columbia University, for spreading the word and supporting the event. Professor Armstrong is going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, I believe, and then Chloe is going to engage her in some kind of discussion and commentary, and then Andrea will lead a moderated discussion. But there will be time at the end for those of you with questions. So when you have a question at any time, feel free to type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You don't have to wait until the actual Q&A time at the end. You can put it there, and Professor White will be able to access it and read out your questions and comments. So it's a great pleasure to be working tonight with Andrea White on this event. Thank you very much. A cherished colleague at Union Theological Seminary, literally next door to the religion department here at Columbia. And we've had some great discussions over the past few years about political theology and the history of Christianity in the United States. And it's really nice to be working together this evening. So Andrea White is an associate professor of theology and culture at Union Theological Seminary. She was educated at Oberlin as an undergrad, and then I believe took an MDiv from Yale, and then went to the Div School at the University of Chicago. Am I getting all that correct? Quite an incredible string of institutions there, and is now, again, as I mentioned, at Union. She is the author of The Back of God, A Theology of Otherness in Karl Barth and Paul Ricoeur. And I don't know if this next book is out yet, or if it's coming out soon. The Scandal of the Flesh, Black Women's Bodies, God, and Politics. She is very involved in the networks working on political theology and thinking about political theology, and has actually known Amoria, I think, for many, many years. So it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you, Andrea. And again, just another word of thanks, especially to Chloe, who I've had conversations with over the past several years, and have really enjoyed getting to work with. As Andrea will soon say a bit more about Chloe, but Chloe is a grad student here at Columbia in the anthropology department, and someone who has held different fellowships at IRCPL, and it's been an absolute pleasure to work with her, and for me to feature the ideas and voices of graduate students at Columbia is an important commitment, and I'm very glad to be able to do so tonight as well. So with that all said, I will turn over to you, Andrea, and we can take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And I think you've set us up nicely to get started. I will also start by thanking Chloe and giving Chloe the credit for the foresight and wisdom. I already know, Chloe, that your work is brilliant, because you are brilliant in suggesting that we put Amoria Armstrong on the lineup this evening. So thank you, thank you. Amoria Shea Armstrong is assistant professor of race in American religion and culture at Virginia Tech. She works in the fields of Black studies, political theology, and queer theory. She's currently completing her first book manuscript, The Trouble of Redemption: Black Political Desire and the Afterlife of Christian Order. The book examines how the libidinal economy of Christian redemption is refigured in new world formations of the anti-Black racial order, and develops a theory of theological reproduction that enables a political theological account of the troubled and troubling subjectivities emergent in the shadow of Reconstruction's failure. It's a personal honor to be able to introduce her this evening, because I have known her, at least a decade, something like that. And I hope it's okay. I didn't ask permission, but she was a former student and research assistant, and I am just very, very excited to be here with her. And I am now her student. So what a thrill to be introducing her. It's truly an honor. And Chloe Samala-Fo, who is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at Columbia, will be our respondent this evening. Her research interrogates the historical and emergent dilemmas of Black reproductivity in post-apartheid South Africa. Oriented by the convergences of race and gender, violence and desire, her dissertation is rooted in and responds to the idioms of classical anthropology: myth, sacrifice, kinship, the gift, ritual, and fetish. So we're delighted to have you both lead our discussion, and we look forward to a really exciting conversation on this work. And thank you, Amoria, for your paper. I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. And yes, it's been over a decade. So I think 2010 maybe was when we first met. But it's great to see you, and thanks to everyone who made the event happen, to Matthew for the invitation, and Chloe, thank you for suggesting me. I'm so excited we get to talk with each other in this way. And thanks to Gabriella for all the technological assistance. Okay, so I will jump into this pretty quickly. This talk is like a sketch of some thoughts I'm trying to develop around how thinking with people like Cedric Robinson and Sylvia Winter, Cynthia Hartman, Hortense Spillers is always in the background, but scholars like this in Black studies can recast the field of political theology. So Carl Schmitt has this idea that political theology could also be understood as a sociology of the concept. And I feel like Winter and Robinson especially are kind of ideal examples of kind of interrogating concepts in a way that I think coincides with political theological inquiry. So is there a way that reading with them, we can kind of displace maybe the supremacy of the concept of sovereignty and political theology and enable more, I guess, conceptual interrogations to emerge. So I guess something I am interested in with trying to overturn this kind of standard idea of political theology is to think about how doing a sociology of a concept in terms of Blackness contributes to an account of what Sylvia Wynter might call the preservation of the genre of man that's overrepresented as the human. And I think this approach can also lay out some epistemological and existential tools that are at work in securing the Black situation as that 0 degree, which anchors the reproduction of this order of being. So I wanted to talk today about the idea of ordered liberty, and Matthew invited me to give a talk, maybe thinking through like how we might understand Dobbs. And this is kind of like approaching Dobbs at a slant through this recurring idea of ordered liberty that Alito expresses throughout. And so there's 3 kind of elements of the Supreme Court's political theology that I want to focus on in this talk. The first concerns the relationship between order and myth, specifically how Western order and the political authority it legitimates is plagued by an irrationality it necessarily renounces in order to preserve its own sense of significance. The second is regarding the form of freedom or liberty that the law reproduces and the unfreedom it depends on to preserve the enjoyment of the benefits of freedom. And the third regards the reproduction of an order of existence whose libidinal economy is preserved through the production of coherence, which incarnates the epistemological and existential coordinates that anti-Blackness holds in place. So I'm kind of going through like the question of order, the question of liberty, and then how to think them together. And that kind of corresponds to thinking with Robinson, thinking with Hartman and Wynter. So yeah, that's kind of how the talk is going to unfold. But let's see. Yeah, I think overall, I'm just wanting to clarify how anti-Blackness is preserved in and through the reproduction of an order of knowing, being, and feeling that is animated by the form of freedom or liberty birthed in the New World Project. So I'm going to kind of give this and then conclude by thinking about how the unreason of order and liberty can help us see the political theological sense of ordered liberty that's revealed in Dobbs and how it depends on an anti-Black libidinal economy. So this idea of ordered liberty is comes up in the Dobbs decision about 11 times, and Alito, in his opinion, defines it as what sets limits and defines the boundary between competing interests. But a more kind of common way of thinking about it is how to balance individual freedom with the common good, or kind of the interests of society in virtuous, a virtuous kind of society and the cultivation of the common good. So a kind of common figure who's referenced in this idea of ordered liberty is Edmund Burke, who's kind of a philosophical forefather of conservatism. So there's this quote I want to read from him that I think is very pertinent to this idea of ordered liberty. He says, "Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites, in proportion as their love of justice is above their rapacity, in proportion as their soundness and sobriety of understanding is above their vanity and presumption, in proportion as they are more disposed to listen to the counsels of the wise and good in preference to the flattery of knaves. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. Men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their own fetters. And so throughout this idea of ordered liberty, there's this sense of human, I think not just depravity, but like human licentiousness, and this sense that disorder and the threat of disorder is imminent. And so ordered liberty needs to be cultivated in order to keep this at bay, in order to keep man's soul, I guess, virtuous and properly ordered and oriented, and also to keep society and society's kind of governance well ordered and not descending into anarchy. So part of why this idea was interesting to me is because of the argument that Alito and also Clarence Thomas and the other majority opinion justices take in arguing against Roe and Casey, and Roe and Casey's attempts to secure the right to abortion through recourse to the 14th and 15th and the 14th and 5th Amendments. So Alito ends up saying that the arguments in Roe and Casey end up arguing too much. They essentially become speculations on human nature and the nature of existence, rather than the history and tradition of fundamental liberties recognized by the Constitution. And it is this speculation that results in the court's overreach against states' rights in determining governance of abortion. In this way, the majority opinion of the court casts itself as protecting the court's legitimacy by protecting the balance between states' rights and individual liberty. In this way, the Dobbs decision's efficacy is cast as a kind of sober and reasoned correction of establishing Roe as the law of the land. Yet this approach works precisely by obscuring the speculative formations that legitimate the history and tradition that constitutional originalism is predicated on, and this idea of ordered liberty as well. So in establishing ordered liberty as the key metric of Roe's legitimacy, the conservative justices' opinions imply that the idea of ordered liberty is somehow free from speculation or the ideological, in the sense of human nature or the necessity of order, or the form of freedom that it assumes in this concept. So as much as the appeal to history and tradition via constitutionalism and the common law is meant to establish the right to abortion as a recent appearance in political history, the conservative justices also, the way that they make this argument also obscures the kind of transcendent moral order that ordered liberty itself relies on and understands as naturally and divinely revealed. And there were like many instances of this idea of ordered liberty that I wanted to dig into, but one that stood out to me was by Russell Kirk, who is a kind of influential neoconservative intellectual, and he has this book called The Roots of American Order that's kind of an intellectual history or genealogy of American order. And so he's trying to show how the correspondence between the roots of moral order in the soul and the roots of civil society and the order of the republic are the foundations of kind of American ideals and its greatest values. So he does this interesting charting of this idea of order from Jerusalem to Athens, from Rome to London, and finally to the Americas. And so he understands this idea of order as passed down from the Hebrews, and this is his language, to the founding fathers. So there's an interesting way that he's kind of fashioning this narrative about a history and tradition of ordered liberty that's intended to be practical and grounded in historical experience rather than abstract ideas. But I think, as we'll see more, a lot of these abstractions do come into play anyways. Oh, and one other thing I noticed reading this, I was just like, somebody needs to write something on the political theology of national treasure, because I feel like the kind of sentimental and like romantic ideas of American values, et cetera, and that have a lot in common with the kind of like myths of order that are happening in works like this. So if anyone wants to write that, I would love to read it. But this whole goal of cultivating order is so that society can stave off descent into anarchy and also preserve the exceptional character of America, as well as preserving the soul of man. So order, according to Kirk and other conservatives in this tradition, is the first need of the soul and the first need of society. Against modern ideologies such as communism that threaten order, this idea of ordered liberty is based on the notion of humanity and society as kind of organic and dynamic and in need of cultivation and stewardship to grow. So there's an interesting like reproductive layer to this idea of ordered liberty in the sense that it understands itself against a kind of rigid permanence or kind of free for all progressiveness, and trying to cultivate the appropriate amount of freedom and order within society. So something striking about this sense of ordered liberty and this idea that it's historically grounded rather than abstract is that there is quite a bit of speculation and unreason that animates these arguments. So in Kirk's myth, The Specter of Disorder, this story of a legacy of order that's under threat and in need of defense reveals a kind of irrationality that's preserved in the assumption of order as necessary and the assumption of this form of freedom under constraint as the ideal form. And this mixture of reason and unreason serves to legitimate the reason and unreason of other political paradigms and concepts that are predicated on similar myths. So oftentimes this idea of ordered liberty is invoked to legitimate the free market and economic narrations of money's origins and function in society, or the family and the proper arrangement of kinship or relations. So it's interesting to think about the kind of like holistic view that this idea of ordered liberty depends on. And this is where I think Cedric Robinson is really helpful, and the Cedric Robinson of Terms of Order, which is his first book, but his critique of order, I think, allows us to see how the assumptions of order in this idea of ordered liberty are kind of not as free from the speculative as we might think. I think that he helps us see how the preservation of a society's historical existence and the preservation of a society's legitimacy is predicated on reproducing socialization and reproducing a relationship between epistemology and existence that allows them to basically confirm each other. So Robinson, in following him, I see the point of attending to the irrationality in this idea as resting not on a denigration of the irrational, but a way of understanding the irrationality as an effect of a community or group's need to comprehend its own existence. So Robinson kind of talks about these like histories of these groups and the kind of significant events and how order serves as a way of helping people to kind of comprehend their continued existence. And I think this allows us to develop an analysis that takes up the assumptions embedded in these concepts, while also clarifying how they work to legitimate the paradigms of particular social orders. And it's precisely because the legitimation of a society depends on the legitimation of that society's unconscious, its myths and its symbols, that the rationality of the political paradigm has to be understood as mixed with irrationality. And that's kind of Robinson's idea of this mixed paradigm of reason and unreason. But the kind of rationality of Western order has to efface this irrationality in order to kind of naturalize itself and naturalize its concepts of the political and reason as legitimate. And I think this is where there's some interesting overlap between him and Sylvia Wynter, which I'll kind of get into after turning to Hartman. So we've looked at this idea of order, but I think we can turn to this idea of liberty that is the counterpart to this notion of order. Hartman, I think, helps us see that there's a genealogical connection to anti-Black forms of freedom and the production and reproduction of subjectivity. So if we read scenes of subjection in political theological terms, we can see some interesting places that political crises of liberty are tied to like Black theological crises of kind of existential illegitimacy. So how could we think about genealogies of Black illegitimacy and crises of Black reproduction as also kind of expressing something in political theological terms? One example of this is Hartman's reading of formations of Black subjectivity in the wake of emancipation. I think she really clarifies how this purported resolution of political crises that racial slavery initiated occurs not only through a political re-narration of Black people within the nation's kind of divine plan, but also a theological re-narration of Black people that she doesn't so much analyze, but that's happening at the same time within a kind of universal mission of God's plan of redemption. So this redemptive belonging in the national family corresponds to re-narrating Black subjectivity and its redemptive belonging in the family of God. And so there's a way there's a theological reproduction of subjectivity happening at the same time. There's this political reproduction of Black subjectivity. And this reproduction of Black subjectivity, as Hartman argues, is in service of a form of freedom that actually reinscribes Black subjection. So I often find her reading of like the domestic manuals or fictional literature and handbooks and tracts for the freedmen as really helpful examples of how the form of freedom that is fashioned in the wake of emancipation depends on educating the newly freed into a form of existence that locates Black civic incorporation and the overcoming of slavery in individualistic forms of industry, agency, and domesticity that burden Blackness with unfreedom. And I think this ties into this idea of ordered liberty, in part because of this whole emphasis on kind of like controlling one's passions and one's appetites and the formations of one's desire according to the common good. Like it's precisely this idea of freedom that's imposed on Black people in the wake of emancipation. So there's a kind of interesting specter of managing, I think, Black desire and Black desire for freedom in this idea of an ordered liberty. And then I think finally, there's also a way that this desire to kind of properly order the Black household in the wake of emancipation ties into some of the ordering of gender. I think that something like Dobbs lends itself to. So Hartman talks about how in the wake of emancipation, the figure of the freedman kind of comes to stand in for Black people as a whole. And there's a way that the education of formerly enslaved people in proper forms of domesticity and managing the household also coincides with these, like management of Black gender and educating Black people into like patriarchal gender roles. And so I think there's a interesting way that this form of freedom that one is supposed to desire actually serves as a kind of mode of spiritual and material capture, accumulating and dispossessing Black people of, I don't know, maybe one might call it kind of like the power that their spirituality produces, or the value that Black spirituality or Black spirit produces and reproduces in the world. So I think there's an interesting way that the narrative of promise and fulfillment that freedom trades in serves to kind of lay the foundations for this libidinal economy that depends on anti-Blackness and the kind of governance of Black flesh and disciplining of Black desire. So to close, I kind of just want to pull things together by thinking this idea of order and liberty with Sylvia Wynter, because her idea of the sociogenic principle is, I think, very helpful for understanding how order and liberty corresponds to a normative like order of knowledge and a normative order of being. So in her work, she talks a lot about how the secular world has inherited Christianity's normative order of knowledge, which was embodied in theology and expressed in the founding structural opposition generated from the bonding topos of the order, which was the opposition between spirit and this signification of new life that one gets through Christian baptism, and the flesh, or the life of unregenerate natural man before birth, and a life that was now death. So here Wynter is concerned to show how the emergence of human sciences, particularly biology, inherit Christian theological orders, sedimented associations in terms of order, as well as its inheritable program of stored prejudgments based on the interpretation of the Bible and on the canonical dogma, as well as the overall knowledge of Christian society. But what I think is interesting here is how this kind of idea of like spirit and flesh also kind of corresponds to this idea of like order and disorder, or an ordered liberty versus a disordered liberty. So the kind of like fleshly association with death or kind of depravity, and an unregenerated spirit kind of highlights this fear of anarchy and disorder of the soul or society that ordered liberty is meant to stave off, while the spirit and the kind of like properly ordered soul is one who attains like a kind of new life, or gets to enjoy the benefits of new life, or the benefits of well-ordered freedom. So I think Wynter's idea of the sociogenic principle kind of clarifies how the experience of what it's like to be human, and the use of these discourses and what she calls coercive semantic technologies help to transform the sense of the self, or kind of form the consciousness of particular societies in particular historical moments. And so it's this principle, she says, that by which the institutions imprint and provide a constantly transmittable and transcultural application of a common reality. So basically, because of the way that these kind of codes of both biological and cultural are mixed together in the sociogenic, the construction of a common reality is possible, and what kind of orders or rules this common reality and enables its reproduction is kind of what a lot of her work investigates. So if the notion of ordered liberty is meant to orient the human towards the common good, then that idea of the common good and that idea of ordered liberty in the human is predicated on a sense of self, which is consonant with a common reality. And Wynter's interrogation of this production and reproduction of common reality illuminates, I think, the significance of these kind of theological inheritances that are expressed underneath this idea of ordered liberty in something like the Dobbs decision, but kind of throughout US political life. So rethinking Dobbs in light of this political theology of order, liberty, and Black reproduction, I think can highlight how ordered liberty becomes the measure of common reality and is able to adjudicate the legitimacy of Roe and Casey. So Roe attempts to situate physiological reproduction and the fashioning of families within the private sphere, which registers for these advocates of ordered liberty as an attempt to close off the significance of reproduction from the common reality that the Supreme Court serves to protect. So we can see this in Alito's opinion and its castigation of Roe and Casey for their failure to establish the right to an abortion in a notion of ordered liberty. And these are a little lengthy quotes, but I think kind of really clarify a lot about what's going on here and how this idea is being appealed to. So Alito says, instead of seriously pressing the argument that the abortion right itself has deep roots, supporters of Roe and Casey contend that the abortion right is an integral part of a broader entrenched right. Roe termed this a right to privacy, and Casey described it as the freedom to make intimate and personal choices that are central to personal dignity and autonomy. Casey elaborated, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. The court did not claim that this broadly framed right is absolute, and no such claim would be plausible. This is still Alito. While individuals are certainly free to think and say what they wish about existence, these are in quotes, meaning, the universe, and the mystery of human life, they are not always free to act in accordance with those thoughts. License to act on the basis of such beliefs may correspond to one of the many understandings of liberty, but it is certainly not ordered liberty. And I found this one, I have to say, I experienced my brain almost melting as I read through the Dobbs decision, because the arguments and the kind of implicit assumptions are kind of outstanding and simply hit one over the head. But by allowing the states to determine the significance of the fetus, the majority of the opinion of the court also employs this notion of ordered liberty to legitimate the reproduction of an idea of fetal personhood and the racial fetus as a fact, which kind of emerges in Alito referencing like Black fetuses or something. Like in one footnote, he's like, you know, advocates of pro-life advocates say that abortion negatively harms the African-American population, which we can see because the disproportionate amount of aborted fetuses that are Black, which is a fascinating idea to kind of dig into, which maybe we can get into more later. But here we can see that this repeated assertion of the personhood of the fetus and the racialization of the fetus culturally and legally over the past 30 years serves to bolster the court's authority to safeguard the management of an anti-Black order of existence. So this order is secured as the relationship between the understanding of peoplehood in the US, which is oriented by a field of knowledge that makes fetal personhood and racialization perceptible, and where the enjoyment of freedom is made corollary to the repeated incarnation of a burdened subject of freedom that is predicated on the preservation of Black capture. Understanding the terms of Black reproduction as concerning the reproduction of an order of existence and epistemology thus situates the Dobbs decision within the ongoing conflicts of white reason and life that anti-Blackness serves to quell. So that is the end of my talk. I'm very excited to chat with Chelsea and the rest of you all about this.
Amoria, thank you. That was brilliant and provocative. I'm going to introduce Chloe now to offer her response. Chloe, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Amoria, for your talk. Okay. So excavating the dependence of the court's ruling on the significance of order to conceptions of liberty, Armstrong argues that the afterlife of racial slavery and reproduction's entanglement in the decision provide the material and conceptual support for the elaboration of an epistemological and existential order and sovereignty that is foundational to the court's authority, power, and function. In so doing, Armstrong brings into focus, through reproductivity, the predicament of ordered liberty, where the structural and temporal logics at play, where the structural logics do not map neatly onto the temporal ones. We are thus confronted with the primal confusion between law and lawlessness constitutive to the foundation of the state. By way of Robinson's conceptualization of order as born of a mixed paradigm, Winter's extension of Fanon's sociogeny, and Hartman's concept of burdened individuality, Armstrong investigates what we might call a supplementarity between ordered liberty and anti-Blackness. Here, spirit and flesh map onto the desired effects of ordered liberty, which in turn ensures spirit, disordered liberty, and disordered liberty here becomes fleshy, licentious, predicated on a concept of existence that takes into account pleasure, pain, and the quality of life. In this way, Christianity's inheritable problem and ordered liberty, which is to say the rule of law and tradition, transmits ordered liberty, which ensures the survival of the distinctiveness of the American experiment, preserving in turn the distinctiveness of the Christian order and of the American one, which thus become more critical to the imagination of freedom and the production and reproduction of the subject and subjectivity. And for Armstrong, then, the libidinal economy of ordered liberty maps onto the libidinal economy of anti-Blackness and the authority of the Supreme Court, that the authority of the Supreme Court is meant to preserve, legitimate, and protect. In his 1980 text, Terms of Order, far less cited than a certain other text that Robinson wrote, Robinson insists that it was the identification of something, which is to say order, which had to be seen for what it is not, to be believed. And it is this that points to a paradigm of society both obscured and reinforced by Western epistemology. To account for the production of what is thematized as the political, which is to say a logical positivist model of reality, Robinson's intervention unfolds against the backdrop of the counter-sciences, to use Foucault's terms, which is to say ethnology and psychoanalysis, to account for the conceptual elaboration of the political. For Foucault, these sciences, ethnology and psychoanalysis, were sciences of the unconscious, which is to say, they do not reach down to what is below consciousness in man, but because they are directed towards that which, outside man, makes it impossible to know, with a positive knowledge, that which is given to or eludes his consciousness. While Foucault refers to the unconscious, which is a structure of desire, Robinson makes recourse to myth. And myth, if we recall Claude Lévi-Strauss, is a part of human speech, and it has to be told. It combines the temporal elements of langue and parole to produce what Lévi-Strauss calls a third referent. And so mythological time is at once historical and ahistorical, revertible and non-revertible, synchronic and diachronic. In myth, language functions on an especially high level for Lévi-Strauss, which means meaning succeeds practically at taking off from its linguistic ground on which it keeps rolling. Put differently, the explanatory power of myth lies in the everlasting nature of what it describes. It is by way of this endurance that Robinson then investigates the notion of political order and its entailing institutional, structural, and ideological facades. For Robinson, then, it is because of these same aspects, its representations, what he calls the fundamental insubstantiation of the political order of things, that has continued unrecognized in any persistent way to human consciousness. However, it is my sense that, and perhaps this is maybe my intervention here, that Robinson's understanding of myth is not sufficient for grasping the impassive formalization of Blackness that characterizes, okay, sorry. However, it is my sense that Robinson's use of myth is not sufficient for grasping the impasse of formalization, which is to say, the non-signifying place for the banished beliefs and practices of the African rendered Black to a mythical irreality and the realm of the teratological. For Levi-Strauss, mythical thought always progresses from the awareness of oppositions towards the resolution. In turn, resolution in myth can function as an effective resolution in actuality. And is it not more precisely than that it is the mediation in myth that actually forecloses or defers the address of contradiction in actuality? And so that's my question. So perhaps Robinson's pursuit then of a fundamental substantiation may actually lead us off course. In short, we're not dealing with a dialectic or a Hegelian struggle to the death, but rather a struggle with and from death, a struggle that seeks to go beyond the death in life that, however dialectical, cannot be grasped by a philosophical anthropology. And this is also perhaps the aporia within the language and discourse of sovereignty as well. And so I would like us to consider here how this aporia that is animating anthropology's constitutive elaboration of man and culture might also help us perhaps rechart the terrain for thinking through this recent decision. So the comparativism that informs anthropology is linked to colonial governance, which was anti-colonial and anti-nationalist, or anti-national and anti-nationalist in many ways, but in at least two main senses. It was anti-nationalist in the sense of that it was often aimed at the obviation or foreclosure of anti-colonial nationalism. And it was anti-nationalist in its displacement of the values of the people with its relativizing notions of peoples as being an equivalent without being the same. And the abstraction that informs this gesture of finding equivalence is at once an opportunity and a lure, a remedy and a poison, which is to say there is no equality without this abstracting gesture. And yet, of course, there is also commoditization and no wage-based oppression without the same principle. And so I would like us to maybe think through the idea that this certain aporia within this language of sovereignty, which is, I think, at the center of Moria's intervention, is born of a coincidence between what Fanon calls the doctrine of cultural hierarchy, which is one aspect of a systemized hierarchization implacably pursued at the level of colonial governmentality, where I guess culture becomes the site of colonial or signs from quote unquote native culture become invested or reinvested with the language of force. So there's a coincidence between the doctrine of cultural hierarchy and the incest taboo, which is to say an atemporal frame of existence that parallels and mirrors the very idea of whiteness, performing the function of drawing boundaries, which are the necessary conditions for whiteness to become an organizing and ideational principle of politics and civil society. So I would like to propose that insofar as the incest taboo is at once temporal and temporizing, functioning as an ontological dead space, it is from here that we might consider how abortion in the context of Blackness might mark an annihilative gesture qua the past, where the out-of-timeness and out-of-placeness of Blackness is also marked necessarily by a negative inheritance with regards to the future. And it is this temporal and temporizing structure that also animates what Hartman calls burdened individuality, the double bind of emancipation such that Black freedom is sutured to hardship, travails, and encumbrance, thus enabling the modes of domination, subjection, and accumulation of slavery to continue. And so in this way, the burden of individuality is slavery's changed form of appearance, affecting a continuity, which in turn is slavery's reproductive logic. And here, if we return to Fanon to think through the imaginative capacities of Blackness, we can then return back to the question of reproduction. So in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon writes, the civilized man retains an irrational nostalgia for the extraordinary times of sexual licentiousness, orgies, unpunished rapes, and unrepressed incest. In a sense, these fantasies correspond to Freud's life instinct. Projecting his desires onto the Black man, the white man behaves as if the Black man actually had them. So that is Black skin, white masks. And in a sense, these fantasies that animate Fanon's narration of the psychosexual arrangement of the colonial situation also correspond to Lévi-Strauss's incest taboo. And I say his insofar as he's the one who perhaps most notably sought to formalize its universality. So for Fanon, then, the Negro archetype, at once spontaneous and cosmic, possesses a hallucinating sexual power that is at the core of European civilization, Western civilization, I guess we could say here, that is redoubled in the sort of racial drama that he says is played out in the open. And insofar as the incest taboo, which for Lévi-Strauss correlates with human existence, it is also anthropology's original sin. And I think I'm also arguing it is also the social and the political's original sin, in that it does not simply mark the division between nature and culture, between instinct and drive, but rather the passage from one to another, affecting the origin of symbolic thought. And so, born of a movement of play permitted by the lack of absence of a center or origin, this passage, which proceeds by way of prohibition, erects in its wake a naturalist myth, or we can talk about it, maybe it's fantasy, the belief that a particular affinity exists between the state of nature and biological truth, or even scientific truth in general. And insofar as the incest taboo marks the unstable juncture of nature and biology, nature and culture, it also becomes one among many names for language. And as with all law and language, it is inseparable from violence. And here the law is the marking of the body as white over Black. And there I'm thinking with Anthony Paul Farley. And so insofar as white over Black is law, as a structure of mediation, it is a desire and orientation that takes the form and force of sexual difference. And it is here that we see also the anthropological basis of feminism. Men pass the phallus between themselves via the medium of women who never appear as such. And perhaps this is also the basis upon which the Dobbs decision is typically addressed and understood in the discourse. I can clarify that later. But within this arrangement, women constitute that which is excluded from the field of representation and made its telos. And to the extent that a critical feminist gesture seeks to reveal how a category like women, in this case, becomes a perceptible site of investment, and insofar as an analytical frame determines the priority over the relationships it establishes, it is in this anthropological and analytical tendency that I also locate another naturalist myth at the interstices of what Fanon calls the Negro myth and the myth of the eternal feminine, the Black woman as concept without object, as imago, whose responsibilization for Blackness entails both contiguity and representational, as well as metaphorical status. This was linked to Black women's function as transmitters of racial identity on the presumption that it did not entail cultural transmission of the sort assumed by Enlightenment humanism. And it is here that I recall Hartman, who argues that the value of Blackness resides in its metaphorical aptitude, whether literally understood as the fungibility of the commodity or understood as the imaginative surface upon which the master and the nation come to understand themselves. And then in turn, I would like to offer a slight corrective. And so the notion of fungibility, and this is perhaps we can talk about this, but this is also maybe where we could rework Robinson and his use of myth. And I wonder if he's not trying to say fetish. So the notion of fungibility refers to the plasticity of the value form and its transposability. And so it is my sense that this formulation on Hartman's part misses the thrust of Marx's critique, which might actually help us attend to the problem at hand. So fungibility allows one to hide the extraction, the theft of surplus. Once again, there seems to be a confusion between exchangism and a critique of particular mode of production. And this is the something extra that was sought from Black people by, this was the thing that was sought from Blackness. Cattle were not enough in the case of colonialism, where I'm usually thinking. This violation of the human capacity to produce in excess, which takes the form of reduction of Blackness to this capacity, simultaneous with the representation of an incapacity to sublimate this capacity in cultural form. And so insofar as incapacity animates anti-Blackness under racial capitalist modernity, it proceeds through a double violation, which is specifically differentiated in sexual terms. The incest taboo then also is operating at the level of gender and race, so it's the racial seduction of gender that is then dissimulated through the law as white over Black, and by which the arbitrary division between nature and culture and our own knowledge of the basic facts of biology issues from the same things, from the same thought process that produce the most arbitrary and artificial distinctions of kinship systems, so that they may be sustained. So the incest taboo then functions much like the fetish of law as the ontological dead space that dissimulates through its appeal to a prior in order to banish it, and through which the arbitrary division between law and lawlessness is resolved. And this contradiction structures the entities then that comprise the reality or the actuality that Robinson is invoking, rather than simply taking place between them, which is, I think, what is happening in his narration. And it is in this sense that the incest taboo marks the moment where signification is jammed between representation and negation, animating a belated temporality of whiteness that is in fact a retroactive projection that produces at once the threat as well as its obliteration in and through Blackness, and its spatialization in and through Africa as the doubled scene of reason's birth in Enlightenment discourse, a return to which is at once feared and anticipated. And I think I will stop there. I just ended. I don't really have a conclusion, but I'm done.
Chloe, thank you. And I'll invite, we have some time for the two of you to have some discussion. So we'll start off with you, Amoria, responding to your respondent.
Yes, well, thank you for like a very rich response. I was very struck by your kind of deepening of the idea of myth and pointing out some of the places maybe Robinson's theory is more consonant with the idea of fetish, or perhaps how he is like not naming, I guess, the kind of antinomies of some of these structures, I guess, between like law and language, or nature and culture, and how something like the incest taboo and sexual difference and also Blackness serve to kind of mark this non-signifying space. Yeah, so I thought that was really fascinating, and I think too was curious about the relationship between myth and fantasy, and how you are kind of tying that to sexual difference, which I thought was a very helpful connection. Especially, I've just been thinking a lot with Jakob Taubes as well recently, and he has a very interesting notion of theology, and he says like the time of theology has come when like the symbols of a group kind of like no longer correspond to their historical moment. So theology works to like renew the symbols for the current historical moment a group is in. And it seems like there's something like reproductive happening in being able to like renew the symbolic that feels like it maybe is related to myth and fantasy, or perhaps what fetish is doing. So yeah, I would be curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think Robinson, I mean, I was hesitating to say this, but I think in his invocation of myth and through, there is like this tenor of dissimulation that's kind of animating his discourse, I think, at all times. So this sense that there's this insubstantiation happening at the level of the political and the function of the leader, et cetera. In an effort, it seems often to kind of grasp the real thing. And so it's kind of this move of unseen to seen. And so that is actually, for me, trafficking on an order of representation, when actually what I think we're dealing with is the sort of double displacement and the veiled substitution through which that displacement can proceed. And so I think that's why Hartman's burdened individuality is useful when she speaks about it in terms of the double bind, because it is through the invocation of Black freedom that the structural continuity of the slave relation can proceed. And I think with her, she doesn't fully like root it through like surplus value, which I think might have been helpful, because it kind of, for me, it's like the demand for surplus value to be generated in and through Blackness, or identification with Blackness as productivity, proceeds through this like misrecognition. And I think fantasy in turn accounts for this process, because there's a way in which myth is seemingly not singular, but universal, whereas that is not quite the case with fantasy as I understand it, as it functions in psychoanalysis. So it is the thing that is set to work within a structure of signification. It is the thing that offers the subject a sort of defensive veiling of that which he cannot fully accept. It is the thing that offers coordinates, but it does not actually prefigure an arrangement. It is like the armature. And so there's a way in which the pieces can move and then the orders can be rearranged, but it's the sort of signifiers that are kind of, those are the things that need to be attended to in their specific order. And for me, I think that's the piece that is important, because I think within the framework of fantasy then, one is, the task is then not to actually locate the real thing that we all cannot see. We're not actually trying to theorize the political in terms of a lie in order to access its truth, but rather to kind of attend to the way in which the political, like the structure of fantasy, is the thing that reproduces itself through its continued dissimulation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
And
I
then,
think,
yeah.
no, I like that. Well, I would be curious, because I feel like, the thing about Robinson is, though, he is kind of like critical, like this is why he's critical of like anarchism and Marxism, is because he feels like they kind of think that they have grasped the real thing, but are kind of taking up the terms of the order that they're a part of. And at the end of terms of order, he's like, we can't just do a simple like dialectical negation of this. And it's like, the thing about order is like, he's not saying like there's no use to order, but he's like, what is the use of order? What can be done with order? Like, and when we don't take it as assumed, like we have more, I guess, strategic use of it.
Do we though?
Well, I think that is the question.
Because I think this is what we can't actually quite, it's like unclear if that is what he's asking to me.
Yeah.
Like, what is the, like, yeah, like what is the upshot of his intervention there?
Yeah. I guess in my mind, it's like he makes it available for analysis in a different way. So I think by kind of suspending the sense of order's necessity and like showing how you can analyze it according to its kind of mythic foundations, that opens up all these interesting connections between things like fantasy and myth, et cetera, that I don't think it tends to get associated with. And so to me, that's like one upshot of it. Like it becomes available for thought in a different way. So, yeah. And I guess also to me, I think like it does tie into to, I think, something that comes up in both Hartman, but especially Winter, which is the question of like the production and reproduction of subjectivity. So I think if Winter's whole thing is like, we need to bring on a whole like new like human that's actually like produced and reproduced on the basis of like, kind of human origins that is not this local form of man that's been universalized. And I feel like there's a similar kind of like thing happening in Robinson where they're both trying to be like, this local form of order or man that has been produced as universal and reproduces its order through like fashioning subjectivity and law to kind of preserve itself. Like, how can we seize the means of reproducing the order of existence? I feel like is kind of the fundamental question both of them are trying to get at.
Yes, I think so too, but I think someone, and maybe if we kind of think to, well, I don't know, maybe I'll ask you this in relation to Black Marxism as well as the terms of order. It's, well, I don't know, well, in the sense that like, I don't know if either, well, no, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say Robinson. It's hard to see sometimes the extent to which he is able to kind of account for the sort of, well, what Fanon would call the Negro myth. So on the
Totally. No, I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah.
Which
And
I
so
think
I think for me, this is
why I have to go to Hartman and with and other people, is I don't think he really gives that account. But to me, I think Cedric Robinson is useful for like literally for thinking about like political theology. Like I think he actually, one might read him as doing political theology.
This is what I was going to say.
And so I find him fascinating in that way because I think his interrogation of concepts is really instructive for how political theological inquiry might go. But I also think on the question of like Blackness, there are some things that are lacking in his account, is how I will say it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the whole thing about Black Marxism or the difficulty of Black Marxism is he doesn't really account for like why the significance of Blackness, like why does that emerge specifically as the form of like that slavery takes when it does. So
yes, and so this is the thing that he should have, I think, yeah, this is where like the surplus value piece would come in, because that is actually precisely the piece that offers an account of both, yeah, the exchange, the question of exchange, as well as its sort of binding material support in and through Blackness, that for me is like the whole thing. Because I feel as though if one makes recourse to myth, one is hard pressed to think through desire that actually makes the mythic, or what Robinson is calling the mythic, a sort of site of investment. And it's actually also that because then, how would I put this? Because I think what Robinson cannot actually offer us is how, or I don't know. Okay, I'm going to ask you again. I'm just going to ask it as a question. But is Robinson also not, or can we, through Robinson, account for the sort of reinvestment, sovereignty's reinvestment with sort of potentiality in the context of things like decolonization, for example, where it's like now we're demanding the restitution of sovereignty, or it's institution
I mean,
presented as an alternative, is presented as an alternative epistemology when perhaps it is, like I was saying, more.
Well, I mean, so I feel like the thing about it is, perhaps yes, if you lean into the terms of order more than Black Marxism, but I think if you're leaning into Black Marxism, then no. And I feel like that is I do feel like he has a kind of also maybe too the anthropology of Marxism as well. Like I feel like he has a kind of helpful skepticism about a kind of simple dialectical negation that I feel like how invocations of decolonialism or something operate can often slide into. But my thing about Robinson is, yes, I don't think that he does everything that I want him to do or wants him to do. And so I find him helpful in this specific register methodologically in thinking about political theology, especially the question of order and reproduction of order. But I think you're right that there's a lot of kind of aporias in his work. But I guess the thing is, to me, I find those generative of kind of locating some of the things that you point out here, what do these failures kind of illuminate about how anti-Blackness is reproduced precisely in this kind of desire for futurity or possibility in the recuperation of original origins or something, for lack of a better word, but this fantasy or romance of origins that kind of undergirds the reproduction of Black subjectivity and Black political desire.
Actually, I wonder.
Maybe,
and so I wonder if that is
thinking, Chloe.
What?
Chloe, as you're just before you respond, I'm going to invite some Q&A from our participants who are with us, and we'll just collect some questions here as you're continuing your conversation. But I'd like to open it up for Q&A from those who are with us, and I would ask you to use your Q&A function rather than the chat function, and I'll collect your questions there and pose them to Chloe and Amoria. So Chloe, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead and finish your thought, and then I'll start with our first question.
Okay. I'm trying to remember what I was saying. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what Fanon, or I guess Winter's rereading of Fanon offers you then. And I wonder if it is, or I wonder if my trouble with Robinson, that maybe I think someone like Fanon might deal with, Sylvia Winter, questionable whether she can deal with it, because sometimes she does feel like a cultural relativist in a very strange way at times. But just, the question of the cultural and how that is actually, what does culture do, and how, what is the work of the cultural as it relates to kind of the question of immanence on the one hand, and then transcendence on the other, and how those are kind of, well, troubled just feels kind of weak, but troubled in the context of Blackness as it relates to the capacity to sublimate in the cultural form.
I have to ruminate on that one.
Or maybe just, what does Winter do for you actually here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of why I turned to Winter was because I feel like she helps you talk about something that I had been using social reproduction to talk about, but wasn't quite like getting at what I was trying to get at. So I feel like the sociogenic principle kind of gets at the reproduction of the order of existence, the order of being and knowing, and like, to me, that kind of like helps reveal the relationship or non-relationship between things in a way that's much clearer than social reproduction, which I think can kind of end up like valorizing like things like care or like
The household,
etc. Yeah, in ways that I think like kind of fail to see how it's a part of the reproduction of the order of existence, even if you kind of revalue those things that are kind of excluded from value to produce value.
and I think yeah, and it's also maybe it's the household functions. Maybe if we kind of try to bring this to the way in which Dobbs is generally read, it is the thing that offers a site to kind of like condense and displace anti-Blackness such that we are now just dealing with a woman's issue that, we're just dealing with this issue.
Let me jump in here with the question, we'll make some space here in our remaining minutes for folks to jump in. Please do, I invite you to type your questions in the Q&A and I'll pose them. But we've got a question here that I'm going to read to both of you. Is the hypothetical conceptualization of the unborn in a legal context as something disembodied yet simultaneously embodied through a particularly charged rhetoric a paradox that is related at all to the fraught tension within ordered liberty explored in these talks?
Well, Moria, I feel like you wrote about this, so I will let you go first.
Oh, thank you, Chloe. Yeah, I do have a paper I wrote in fetal personhood and the cultural production of fetal personhood. But yeah, I do think this figure of the unborn is fascinating precisely because of the concerted effort that has gone into like putting it into the legal context. So in the wake of like Roe v. Wade and the beginning of evangelicals like mobilizing against it, there was a concerted effort for conservative judges and lawyers, etc., conservative people throughout the legal sphere to, as much as possible, like introduce these terms like the unborn or like fetal personhood or like fetal life and all these terms that kind of provide legal justification for the idea of fetal personhood. So I think there's something interesting happening in the way that like the production of knowledge and the reproduction of knowledge in the law is tied to like the production and reproduction of an order of existence. And I do think the unborn kind of serves as this cipher for like investments in the like genre of man, I guess, that is being produced or reproduced socially. So yeah, I definitely think the unborn, and especially the way that I think people love to racialize the fetus and turn, and Jared Saxon has a really great piece on this and like how people like to talk about abortion in terms of like slavery and invoking Dred Scott and things like that, like how endangerment of the fetus through these like terms like the unborn and fetal personhood introduce this like need to protect both society and the human soul from the disorder that comes with something like a right to abortion.
Yeah, and I also wonder, actually, I don't know if I have much to add, but maybe just in the sort of posing of the question, in that it's actually no longer hypothetical, right? It's actually precisely no longer hypothetical. Actually, it's just the thing, because it's now been, it's like through its figuration into law, that it is no longer, like, we're no longer operating in the subjunctive. It's actually like, this is a sort of position. And if we think with your work, where it's like, this is like it is through this understanding of fetal personhood as this sort of thing with this fraught temporality that also consolidates a series of anxieties about miscegenation, etc., that we are no longer we're no longer in the realm of the hypothetical, actually.
Totally. Yeah.
That's actually basically what
We've got another
Oh,
question.
great.
Yeah, Amori, did you want to say something quickly, and then I'll move to the next question?
I think I was just gonna say, I feel like this maybe is related to Chloe, your question earlier about what is the cultural doing with regards to like immanence and transcendence, and it does feel like, and I guess this is the thing I talk about in my paper, but like the formation of like perception and desire that happens through culture seems very like critical here. And so like things like the unborn and all these like figures that are culturally circulated and legally circulated kind of serve to kind of form people's perception and desire around order and the like liberty.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah. So here's another question that's come in. Is there something Catholic, in quotes, about the political theology of ordered liberty? If we think about Schmidt here, but also how many of the justices identify as Catholic?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's interesting because there does seem to be like something Catholic about how it's elaborated in terms of like natural law, and that feels very, I guess, Catholic to me. But also I think I was reading earlier about kind of Schmidt's book on Thomas Hobbes, and just thinking a lot about Schmidt's big investment in the catechon, like restraining disorder, the like anxiety about anarchy, that is kind of what I think funds his desire for a very kind of totalitarian approach to governance. And so, yeah, I definitely feel like there's something interesting here about authority and the cultivation, how like the cultivation of like proper virtue and authority like go together. And so there's this kind of harmony in this hierarchical arrangement or ordering of things, that, and that harmony is precisely what disallows anarchy of the soul or the society from emerging. So yeah, that's interesting. And also it could be interesting too, just to think about how evangelicalism and Catholicism have like gotten mixed up with each other. And like when I was an undergrad, I don't talk about this a lot, but I converted to Catholicism when I was a junior in college. And it was fascinating because they were evangelical Catholics, which I had never encountered before. And I was like, what is going on here? But that's obviously like a thing now. So it'd be interesting too, to like think about like how, like what things from evangelicalism are like funding these politics, but also like what things from Catholicism and how are they getting like mixed up together.
What do you think? Now I'm curious, actually.
Well, I feel like there's how to say, it feels like there's a desire to kind of articulate things, like articulate this order of society, that this idea of order of liberty, I think, wants to promote in these very like aesthetic or like beautiful terms, in terms of like harmony. And that feels very much like it's related to a kind of like theological aesthetics that has Catholic resonances to me. But then it feels like there's a kind of a fervor regarding the like circulation and spreading of this kind of like political and cultural and theological, I think, perspective and understanding that has the fever of evangelicalism, if you will. So yeah, it feels like there's maybe a kind of like evangelical like form of feeling or sentiment that is like at work in the kind of evangelicalization or like circulation of these terms and figures and ideas, but they are kind of structured maybe in terms of like politics and theology in relationship to things that have like to have a long legacy to draw on, and kind of like doing the let's go back to the origins and the origins thing, which I guess could be Protestant, but yeah, I feel like the whole thing about tradition and passing on of tradition in that way feels very Catholic.
Okay.
We have
So I
2
wonder if
minutes
we-
left, and I'm going to ask each of you, actually, we only have 1 minute left. If each of you has a brief closing word, a thought, something that you wish you had said and didn't get a chance to say, even if it's a non sequitur, or yeah, further thoughts you want to add before we
Well,
close.
I just want to say thank you for your response, Chloe. And I feel like now I really have to read Levi-Strauss.
You do. If you want, we can read him together, because I need to read Strauss. And yeah, maybe I'll just say, yeah, thank you for being in conversation. It was very exciting to, have this, because we were trying to have a conversation, but then it didn't happen. And so now it's happening.
Yeah.
And I hope we can continue.
And thank you both. Really, really great conversation, and wonderful to be eavesdroppers on your conversation that you got to have tonight. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much. Andrea, thank you for chairing, and all of the attendees. And we hope to see you next semester. Be on the lookout for the announcement of events. We've got a lot of great things in the works, and we're looking forward to that. So, but let me just thank Amoria and Chloe especially for these wonderful engagements, and yeah, that you've given us a lot to think about, and yeah, so thanks all very much. Have a good evening.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Thank you all.